Hi, I'm Carrie.
And I'm Molly.
And you're listening to the
Two Sisters on Adventures podcast.
So over the course of the next few weeks, we're going to take you through what we call our Summit series. So you may not know this, but Molly and I have been working towards being able to do things that are a little bit outside of the range of backpacking or hiking. For quite some time, we wanted to add mountaineering to our list of skills, but this is something that, you know, how we always advocate for. You can teach yourself to backpack or hike. Sometimes you just have to go out there and do it. For mountaineering, we advocate the opposite. You need to find someone to teach you how to do some of those skills because there is a higher level of risk associated with them. So whether you find a trusted friend who's very knowledgeable or hire a guide, that's something that we would encourage for this series. Molly did not like calling this the Summit series originally, and tell them why, Molly.
Well, and I get to be too wordy, I suppose, but in my experience with mountaineering, I've learned that it's not about the top of the mountain. Like, that is literally the halfway point, and it's not like it's an exciting part of the journey, but I found that in the mountains that I've climbed, the glaciated peaks that we've used our mountaineering skills to summit, the most exciting part is completing the entire process and making it back safely. And so it's worthwhile to complete. Just like the journey itself is the important part. So I think Carrie, when she was maybe like criticizing me a little bit, she was like, so you want to title it It's Not About the Summit, It's About the Journey series? Because that's too long.
Actually, you were criticizing me because I pitched the idea to you. I was like, well, it'd be kind of fun to talk about our mountaineering experiences. And I hope that those of you who are more interested in hiking and backpacking will stay with us through this series, because we also are going to talk about a lot that we learned in terms of mindset that we can apply to backpacking and hiking as well. But it was funny because I was like, well, we should do something, we could call it like the Summit series. And she was like, I do not like that title, the Summit series. I want to call it because it's not about the summit. And then she just like talked about this whole long thing about how it's the experiences and the whole journey there. And I was like, so you want it to be called like, it's not about the summit, it's about the experiences that you have along the way and the things that happen. And it's also a little bit about summiting, but mostly it's about going around and doing the things. And I was like, I don't know there's a length limit on our titles. So I don't think we're going to be doing that. So this summer we were able to summit several mountains, and maybe we even attempted a mountain that we did not summit. And so I hope that you'll just enjoy hearing about those with us as well. So our transition to mountaineering, I would say it came quietly, I guess. It's like, for us, at first, hiking was intimidating, right? And backpacking felt so far out of reach. And then eventually, I think we just got really comfortable backpacking, and
Well, and I was going to say, we always had the same objectives of seeing places and then being in places that were beautiful and interesting and inspiring. And when we started hiking, we could only do shorter distances because that's literally how you start anything, is a smaller experience and then a progression. And then there were certain hurdles that we overcame and fears that we overcame that then opened the door to backpacking, although that was following along the same line of something we always wanted to do. We wanted to see more areas. We wanted to do trails that were longer, that needed more than one day to complete. And I think that mountaineering was kind of this seamless transition, as well as when you are backpacking and hiking, you're somewhat constrained to a certain elevation or location because you don't have the skill set necessary to safely travel on a glacier and to access that higher terrain and the views and the experiences that come along with it. So it was interesting because we were talking to someone this weekend and we talked about how we had climbed Mount Baker, and she was like, I thought you guys didn't do that. And it was like, well, it was just this methodical almost transition from one thing to the next, all things that we enjoy and love. And then if we can do them safely and competently, that's something that we're interested in. And so I think it might be interesting as listeners who enjoy hiking and backpacking. I think a lot of people have interest in learning mountaineering skills. And if you follow any groups on Facebook that are related to mountaineering, you frequently see people posting that are looking to learn skills and they're wanting to know who they could go with to learn. And So I think that, yeah, it should be interesting for people because a lot of people have this area of their heart that they're just like, this would be a really interesting experience, but I don't even know where to start and I don't know how to do this safely. And so we're hoping to provide just that context for you.
And I think we also talk a lot about how, a lot of the time people will be like, well, I never have gone backpacking because there's no one who will take me. And kind of our thing about how often in life, you're not ever going to find someone who's willing to take you. And so you kind of just have to be willing to maybe even invite a friend who seems interested in backpacking and they don't know anything either and just go on a short trip with them. Where mountaineering, it always felt frustrating because living in Oregon, I know there are great organizations like the Mazamas and that kind of thing where you can learn these skills. But with the way our schedules worked, we just were never able to go climbing with them. And we actually did sign up to take a course that would have taught us more rock climbing skills as well as some mountaineering skills in April of 2020. Yeah. So naturally, that did not work out. It was canceled and it wasn't rescheduled for several years. So we didn't get to do that. And sometimes I do think, wow, I kind of wonder what my experience in Oregon would have been like if we had taken that class in April of 2020. But at the end of the day, you can't worry too much about the past. So for us, it was kind of one of those things where at first I was, as a hiker, I wasn't really all that interested in starting to hike because I thought, oh, it's not that interesting, and then I loved it, which made me more interested in backpacking. But it was always kind of like, I just wish that I could go on a glacier because we love glaciers. Like we think they're so cool, the way that they shape the land and the way that they're both static when you look at them, but they're actually flowing. And just the whole ecosystems that they support and create. We think glaciers are so cool. And I remember when we went on the Lyman Glacier on our Glacier Peak wilderness trip, we just thought it was so cool and so amazing to be up there. And so truly,
and actually having walked on several glaciers at this point, that glacier still stands in a very unique way because we were on bare glacial ice for a majority of our time walking across it. And that's not something that you always get when you're on a glacier. So that was a fascinating first experience for glaciers. And then I think that only compounded our interest in exploring glaciated terrain even more.
So I think after the 2020 course didn't work out, we just kind of stowed away our desire to mountaineer in a way because we were doing so much cool stuff for us for backpacking and hiking, and we were able to really push ourselves and go on these long mileage days, these big trips. We did the John Muir Trail. We were doing stuff that just felt really cool, and it kind of felt like we could hardly shove in another sport or another skill. Also, to be honest, mountaineering is very expensive. They talk about the cost to entry. I mean, even if you buy things on sale, even if you, buy things, there's only some things that you can buy used. You don't really want to buy a used rope because who knows how someone has cared for it. You don't want to buy, used carabiners because who knows what have happened to them, or, all kinds of stuff. So it's there are certain things you can't even buy used. And so it just kind of felt like, okay, this is such a commitment and an investment. And at the time we were already thinking about moving back to North Dakota. So it was kind of like, well, why would we learn this new skill and then just move away? So it's funny though, because we were actually living in North Dakota when we decided that we wanted to start mountaineering. And people would be like, that doesn't make sense. There's no mountains in North Dakota. Yeah, I know. I'm pretty much well aware. But it was February of 2023. And for a long time when I'd worked in Oregon, actually, I would look at mountaineering courses, and there was this one course that I'd kind of decided if for some reason I ever wanted to do a mountaineering course, I would do that course. And it was through this company called Pro Guidance Ski out of North Bend in Washington. But the reason I wanted to do it through them was they were one of the few companies I could find that had an introductory course to climbing in the North Cascades. And if you know us, we love the North Cascades in Washington. It's a beautiful park. Lake Diablo, all those things that you see on Instagram are really pretty. But more than anything, I think we love the ruggedness, the way that you can feel like you're escaping from the crowds, the sea of peaks, right? When you're looking out from one high elevation, you just see so many peaks in the distance. So it's just a really stunning area. And I always thought the North Cascades are like a mountaineer's playground, if you're good. And
the good mountaineers named things like Mount Fury and Mount Torment.
Yeah. It's kind of interesting because they talk a lot about the person who had a ton of first ascents in the North Cascades, and when you're the first person to climb it, you get to name it. And they said he doesn't like talk very much about his experiences on those peaks. Like, he was a very quiet man. He didn't keep like a journal, but they were like, you could kind of tell how he felt about them by their names, because he never was naming them like Mount Fun Summit.
Mount Sunshine.
Yeah. And for Molly and I, we're really not that interested in like alpine rock climbing, because honestly, we were able to go rock climbing pre-2020 quite a bit. But then after 2020, our friends who would go rock climbing with us and who had the skills to kind of teach us ended up moving away. And so we kind of fell off that horse. So it's like, we know for a fact that we don't have the rock climbing skills to take it to alpine rock climbing, or what they call trad climbing. And so we weren't really looking for that sort of information in a summit, but this course was mostly about glacial mountaineering. There was a tiny bit of alpine rock, but you were going to go with a guide. And so it was like this dark night in February of 2023. And for some reason, we kind of had just started discussing, like, I would just love to like go on a mountaineering trip just to see what that's all about. And it kind of felt, I mean, after we did the John Muir Trail, that was such an awesome experience. But then it's kind of like, where do you go from there? Like, we're still not really that interested in hiking the Pacific Crest Trail or the Continental Divide Trail, you know, those really long distance trails. We've done a ton of sections on the Pacific Crest Trail. We've hiked a ton of different areas in Oregon and Washington. And we'd even done we hadn't done the Tahoe Rim Trail yet. No, we hadn't. But it felt like, where do we go from here? And it kind of felt like we had achieved the pinnacle. I'm just kidding. Obviously not. But it felt like we kind of achieved what we wanted to do. And it was becoming less, not that I'm looking to do things that are stressful, but it was like a little bit less challenging. Like, when I'm going to go on a backpacking trip for 7 days on a trail, I'm just like, oh, okay, I just throw my stuff in my pack. You know, I know what I need for food. I know what I have my setup all dialed in. And it's kind of just like a robot. And then you just go backpacking, which is still super fun. But it gets harder and harder to find those trails, and especially trails that aren't like permitted. And so we were kind of talking about, maybe it would just be fun to take a mountaineering course. And if we like it, you know, maybe we can start investing in learning it. And if we hate it, we never have to do it again. So we went online. Molly was like, well, can you find that course? I'm like, obviously, I can find it in like 2 seconds. And we decided that we were going to go on a mountaineering trip that summer.
Yeah. So I think we looked into the course, and it was in February. And I think
course was not in February.
Sorry, but in February is when we like looked at the course. And I think we bought it within probably 20 days of looking at it seriously.
Oh, yeah.
So it was March, and we were like locked in. Like, there was a policy where you could get a refund if you canceled in a certain time frame, but we were going to do this course. So it was going to be in August of 2023. So now you sign up, and there's a gear list attached to it. And so, you know, you have certain gear that you use for like layers of warmth in hiking and backpacking, and you know, your like trekking poles and your headlamp and these things that are standard items. So you get the gear list for the mountaineering course, and it's pretty incredible how that is just magnified immensely. So you add new layers of clothing, you add now many pieces of gear. And so there are certain things that the guiding service would provide for us, like a rope, and some other gear like pickets, but we had to purchase or rent quite a few items. And so that's when you have to make this decision.
And it's like extra hard because we didn't really have any friends who did mountaineering, so we couldn't just text our friends and be like, what's the best, you know, brand for such and such? What do you use? It was like, Molly really was just like reading gear reviews, you know, like just, I feel like you invested so much time and energy into trying to figure out what thing was like both the best price point for us as beginners who maybe we're not going to commit to climbing forever, and also functional enough that it could last us.
Yeah. And so the representative for Pro Guide and Ski, you could obviously email with questions. So she was helpful, but then I think it's still just like this tough thing where you have to decide what works for you.
Well, again, it's not like it's your best friends where you feel like, I'm going to email you 70 times a day. You know what I mean? Yeah. Like, you feel like you have to show some sort of restraint. And I will say, like, the world of climbing is a little bit funny because, you know, there's a lot more men who do it, and that's totally fine. Sometimes I'm like, I think maybe it's because the Boy Scouts actually taught mountaineering skills back in the day. And I wonder if that's kind of where maybe more men are have those skills already. I don't know. It doesn't matter. But it's kind of like you don't ever want to come into it as like the two girls who are like, oh, these girls were emailing us 70 times a day, like questions about, I don't know, their boots. And maybe that's just us being like prideful or silly, because I'm sure they would have been plenty nice. But again, it's not like it's your best friend you're emailing. You're emailing the company that's going to guide you. You know what I mean? So you want to kind of tamp it down a little, right?
I had this certain impression that I needed to maintain. And so there were questions that I thought that I had covered, really, that when we then got to our gear check, we realized we didn't know anything about, which is good because they had a gear check. But anyways, so yeah, there was a few sales. I think it was like Memorial Day sales then that we took advantage of to acquire things like an ice axe and some carabiners and different lengths of cordelette for a crevasse rescue kit that we had to bring to the course. So there was a lot of acquiring of gear. And once again, there are guide service companies that will provide a lot of items for rent, like even glacier glasses and such. And so those companies, don't really get you to invest in those items. And it was interesting because Pro Guide and Ski, they didn't have every single item in the world available. Like you could not rent.
Business.
Exactly.
It's a smaller business.
Like you could not rent a down like puffy from them. You could not rent glacier glasses. And so Carrie and I almost thought that was maybe a nice thing though, because it does give you like a little bit more ownership of preparing for the process versus you show up and then they just have everything for you. So that was interesting, and we will talk more about our experience with them, but we do not regret going with their company at all. Like we think the way that they did it was appropriate.
Yeah. So once we gathered all our gear, or what we thought was all of our gear,
which was a lot,
we did start training. And I think that year there was kind of that question mark in my head of like, can you live in a very flat state where like the highest point is 3,000 feet above sea level or something like that? And we've never even been there. And can you live there and still train for what you need to train your body for mountaineering, right? Because you have to carry heavier packs. You're going uphill very sharply, and so we were pretty pleased though, because we, did a ton of weighted walking with our pack weight almost like definitely heavier, I'd say, than what we use backpacking normally. And
it was about, I think, 32 pounds.
Yeah. And honestly, when I put on my mountaineering pack for the first time, I was like, this actually feels better than what we were training with. And then we went and we did the Timberline Trail because we were like, well, at least we'll have 3 days of kind of being underweight and doing elevation training for that, which shockingly turned out great. But it was funny because we did 3 days on the Timberline Trail, then we had 2 days, and then we started our mountaineering course. And so while we were on the Timberline Trail, there was this one spot where we had service, and Molly actually got a phone call from the guy that was going to be our guide. And one thing that I always thought was super neat, we had signed up for a public course. It was not private because it's cheaper, if there's more people in the group. But it was really cool for us because no one else signed up for the course the same weekend as us. And so the guide actually called Molly and was kind of like, what things are you looking to get out of this course? Like, are you just looking for a guide to take you up on this specific peak and then back down safely? Or like, what are your goals? And so Molly kind of explained to him that our goal was we want to be able to do glacial objectives, ideally without a guide, because, guiding services cost money. And he was just so great. He was like, yeah, okay, so I'll kind of plan the course to be around that objective of you want to know everything that you can possibly, learn in a 3-day course. And then I'll kind of we'll go from there. And
it's interesting because do you have something else? Okay. He had a lot of ideas of what we could do. We were in the Boston Basin in the North Cascades. And so Carrie and I have heard about and seen information about the ptarmigan traverse. And so I use that as kind of like a blueprint of like, if we could gain the skill set to do something like the ptarmigan traverse one day, that would be an objective for us versus saying, like he probably hears often, is like, I want to climb Mount Rainier or something like that. So we used a traverse because that was what we were interested in, right? We like to cover mileage. We like kind of like that trekking aspect of covering longer distances, and we just wanted to be able to cover distances that we were not able to cover because of glaciated terrain. So I liked it because our guide, Jeff, he was like, oh, so you're looking to just add a little tech to your trek, which is basically what it was, right? Making things a little bit of technical, but still kind of holding to that trekking mindset. So he even talked about like he could do a trek with us where we went from like at one point down across this saddle to another glacier and got this peak and did this thing. And I think that he then afterwards, reflected on it and decided that we needed to simplify how much we were doing in the course just so that we could learn the content because it was only 3 days. So there were lots of ways that he could both expand what we were doing or decrease it so that we could focus on like different skills. So I thought it was pretty impressive, just his knowledge base. And then do you remember his certifications, Carrie?
I don't remember his specific ones, but I know that Pro Guide and Ski always has guides that are either AMGA certified, which is the American Mountain Guides Association, or they're working towards their AMGA certification. And so it was kind of interesting because we didn't know anything really about the certifications, right? This is all new to us. But basically, I think they would say like it's like having kind of like a PhD in the mountains. You know what I mean? And so there are different levels that they can have and different certifications that they can have. But quite a few of them are working towards like their international mountain guide certification as well. So then they can guide internationally. I think that was the one that they call the PhD of mountaineering. So basically it's like all your guides are like have spent a lot of hours in the mountain. They've done a lot of training. They've done coursework. I feel like sometimes he would reference like papers that he'd read. And I was like, this is amazing because I feel like sometimes people look at, mountaineers or people like that. And you're kind of like, oh, they're just out there recreating, because they don't want to work a real job. And it's like, no, these people are actually like highly trained and highly skilled and willing to teach those skills and pass them on. Because someone was talking the other day about how they're the like backcountry skiers and climbers traditionally was a very small community. So if someone wanted to learn, there was a ton of experienced people who could, relatively small, but like, it wasn't like you'd say, well, here's 18 people who just started last year that can teach you. No, it was like, oh, well, these people have 10 years of experience that you can learn from. But now, because there's been such a boom in that type of recreation, it's like people are saying it is a little bit better to go with guides now because a lot of the people in the community might only be in their first like 2 or 3 years of being part of that sort of recreation. So it's kind of an interesting thing that I had never really thought about. Like I hadn't thought like, oh, maybe I can learn from someone who's, got his like degree, quote unquote. It's not a degree, it's a certification in, mountaineering. And so it was really interesting to kind of see that aspect. And it definitely made me feel more comfortable and more safe.
And when we spent time with him and learning with him, I'll just bring up one more thing Carrie mentioned. He frequently referenced papers that talked about, different angles and forces and applications of technique. So you knew that he wasn't just showing you something that someone else had showed him. He was teaching you best practice and up-to-date techniques, which, mountaineers, they say, there are bold mountaineers and there are old mountaineers. There are no old, bold mountaineers. So, wow, that was butchered. But basically the thing is you can take risks, but if you continue to take risks, you're going to end up in a bad way because this is a sport that, and a technique, a skill set that there is inherent risk involved. So the point I was going to make is that you could tell that his practice was something that was evolving with research and that he wasn't just doing something he'd seen someone do 20 years ago, which was, as a client, I would say very encouraging. And then, yes, just knowing like the skills that he was teaching us were best practice and he was able to work through many scenarios dynamically because of the skill set that he had.
Which the flip side of that and the really challenging part of mountaineering for us, I think, is that there's no right way to do anything a lot of the time. There are right ways to do things in certain circumstances, but just because you do something one way one time does not mean you should do it that way the next time, because you have to take into account, the slope angle, the way the snow's behaving right then. And so there's so many different things. Like you could say, well, so you should always do blah, blah, blah. And he'd be like, no, we're doing this right now because this factor. Yeah. But just because this is what's happening right now doesn't mean that in every scenario you apply it that way. And so I don't know. It's just I think it was interesting because before I was like, I really don't want to spend the money on a guide. I really don't want to spend the money on a guide. I wish I had someone who could take me out. But I feel like the amount that I was able to learn and the knowledge that I was learning it in the most up-to-date practices and not, just something someone had done 40 years ago was like really, really valuable to me. Thank you so much for listening to another episode of the
Two Sisters on Adventures podcast.
If you'd like to see pictures or videos from the things that we talked about today, you can follow us on Facebook or Instagram at Two Sisters on Adventures. And we hope you'll join us again next week. Bye.